Okay, colleagues, I think it's time for us to begin. This is the Africa and Knowledge Seminar brought to you by the Chair for Education and Transformation. My name is Karma Noveve, and I will be your facilitator for today. Colleagues, may we please be reminded that we need to have our microphones and videos off throughout the seminar. And of course, after the speakers have spoken, I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments and engagement. Those who are comfortable with writing their comments and questions in the chat section may do so. And those who would like to pose the questions directly to the speakers may raise their hands and I will note them. Now, over to you, Professor Andre Keach, who is the DVC of Engagement and Transformation for our welcoming. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks, Anna. And this is amazing, colleagues, for all of you to join us. So, dear friends, there are no other categories here. A very warm welcome to all of you to the first seminar in the Africa Knowledge series. Over the past few months, we have been debating a key contestation, and that is, why is it that Africa, even in the context of Black studies, African studies, Africana studies, and post-colonial studies, is predominantly written and thought of by analogy, perpetually subjected to reference points and constructed somewhere else? And why is it that universities in our country and on our continent, and us ourselves and others, cannot read Black or African in any meaningful way within the academy? How would a program responding to these questions look like? Mutinda, who has done some amazing work during his PhD journey, Uchenna and I started a discussion rooted in the university's desire to expand its African epistemic experiences and to make better authentic connections with brothers and sisters and others beyond ourselves, to start working on a political project based on the following assumption. The possibilities we can imagine about the future depends on the quality of our self-conception, a point well articulated by Uchenna in one of the notes that he knocked together. Mutinda's arguments around the centrality of an African ontology as key to our work is closely linked to this. Nomalanga, who is the third contributor today, joined our discussion rooted in her overall project on African intellectual traditions. She is part of a group of younger academics who have been key to the transformative intellectual shifts within our university and elsewhere. Our discussions, needless to say, spiraled wider and included conversations in our various networks. And thanks for those from the GDC network and the Critical University Studies network we have joined today, here and in other parts of the world. So thanks for making the time to join us. And this includes also the networks that Mutinda and Uchenna and Nomalanga has brought into this particular space. Institutionally, this series is of immense importance to our university, linking up with the strategic imperatives of social and epistemic justice, Africanization and decolonization, revitalizing the humanities, and redrawing the frontiers between the social and natural sciences, and also, of course, converting these into workable programs. Though hosted by the chair that I am presently the incumbent of, Krishet, the Emengini Institute for Comparative Global Studies, the Center for Philosophy in Africa, and the Faculty of Humanities of our university, the seminar series spans partners from far and wide. And we will be building and growing our networks on the continent and beyond as we proceed. Intellectually and programmatically then, the series tries to formulate a new approach to Africa and knowledge. Allow me to quote from a concept note in length, which has been drafted by Mutinda and Uchenna in the main. Since we are only able to know the world through the conceptual possibilities at our disposal in our specific spaces, the implication is that we must rely on these conceptual possibilities that shape our imagination. What are these resources and how can we rethink them in light of the crucial task of ensuring that Africans do not become prisoners of the freedom won from colonization? This seminar series is a response to this challenge. The aim is to identify, critique, decouple, and remember the epistemic resources through which Africans have attempted to humanize the world and overcome the crisis of habitability in the continent. It is a collaborative endeavor premised on the understanding that the urgent task today is not to rehash the achievements of the past, but rather to use these resources to create new forms of knowledge that are capable of guiding more productive actions today. The seminar series tries to be unique in both format and aspiration. Although the aim is to provide space for experts to share their knowledge with the public, the series would also like to promote the agency of the audiences. The theme for today, Engaging the Present, Africa in the World, kicks off the series that in general will focus on Africa and knowledge guided by the question, what is an African today, not as an identity marker, but as an invitation for us to consider the sort of Africa we think it's worth striving for. For our second seminar early next year, and we have had a number of discussions and lining up some great contributors into this space. But for our second one early next year, we will have Ibrima Sal, the immediate past Executive Secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRA, Africa's leading social research council. He is currently the Executive Director of Trust Africa. So once again, thanks so much for joining us. We hope you will enjoy the seminar series, and we would like to invite you to submit ideas and thoughts to the organizers for different kinds of ways you think the series may unfold. Thanks so much. Thanks, Tama.
Thank you, Prof, for that warm, informative welcome. And now I'm going to read the bios of the speakers, starting with Professor Nomalanga Mkhize. She is a historian and head of Department of History and Political Studies in Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth. Her research interests are in African language historical literatures and has a special interest in pre-colonial themes in early Xhosa writing. She also works in community arts and creative sector. Dr. Mutinda Nzioki is the current director for the Center for Philosophy in Africa at the Nelson Mandela University. He is also a lecturer at the Department of Philosophy. His research interests are situated within the study of Africa, with focus on contemporary complex questions around Africanity, prospective African political thought, and creation of concepts for Africa's future. Professor Uchenna Ukeja is a member of the Department of Philosophy at Rhodes University and director of Emengini Institute for Comparative Global Studies in Worcester, Massachusetts in the United States. He works primarily in the areas of political philosophy, ethics, African philosophy, and critical theory. Now, I call upon Professor Nomalanga Mkhize to deliver her address. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Just as we get into all of this, I have 10 minutes, so let me put on my timer. Just as we get onto this, I get a silly email from a student complaining about the many glitches and issues that we're dealing with behind the scenes as we try to move with this COVID situation. And, the student says to me, well, I also remember you from Rhodes University, so I don't like what you're doing. And I'm thinking, this is why I left Rhodes University, my child, because I don't deal very well with contexts in which class is presumed to be an insight or gives people an insight into how life really works. So now I'm grumpy. So now I'm very grumpy dealing with the kinds of contexts in which we find ourselves, where inequality between variants of Africans, variants of Black peoples, hits hard and impacts the actual knowledge-making process and the learning process itself. I must say that that is the core of what I think is vexing us as Africans. It's the need to deal with multi-layered systems and legacies of inequality, whilst trying to play in this knowledge of shwam English and trying to play in this arena of international knowledge where people can allegedly take us seriously, while we have really deep-set problems in our context and in our systems. And so with that in mind, I have found it very troubling, and I think I've been sharing this for the past couple of months. I found it very troubling that over the past 5 years, we have spoken about creating knowledge for Africa, but have slipped into this position of constant critique of Eurocentrism, which has basically produced very little over the past 5 years, most exemplified by the decolonial trend, which I find not only vacuous and insubstantive, but very disingenuous and careerist in its orientation within the academy. Worse for me than Eurocentric knowledge is when Africans pretend to be making knowledge of their own when they are not, or when Africans pretend that we are developing and generating ideas when all we are doing is positioning ourselves as still outside of the international or the Eurocentric to come and command and complain for their attention. And so I think I've been trying over the past 4 months, and I take this to be a kind of a conversation with Uchenna and with Mutinda. I've been trying to figure out how it is that we as Black people, as Africans, hold ourselves accountable to our own knowledge project and not presume that our class positioning in the university is sufficient for us to be able to continue to claim that we are making advances. There is a tendency within the African humanities to position critique of Europe and critique of the North as a career trajectory in and of itself. Now, in many ways, this is a positioning that we've really taken over the past 20 years. I think in many ways because so many African scholars have been scattered out of their countries, out of their contexts, out of their universities, going around the world, seeking shelter because of the post-colonial state, which is gunned for intellectuals, gunned for academics, chased away its brightest. And so we find that we have an international academic diaspora, which at once has to be African because you're Black wherever you are, and at the same time has to be international so that it can, so that you can find yourself a home wherever you are. And so this positioning of the critique of the West is really less a reflection of the West than it is a reflection of our lostness and our inability to reactivate our agency. The other thing which I have found that we've put ourselves in this corner, this corner where we're at once having to critique the West because we're now needing its help really to survive as international African academics, but also to remind the system that we are African, it dare not insult us. I have found that within this system has been a very chaotic and messy debate and discussion about positioning Blackness and positioning Africanness. So you will see that in the United States, there is a fragmentation of the Black intellectual solidarities between African international immigrants in the knowledge system, as well as African Americans or Black Americans in the knowledge system, in the US in particular. And there, the schism that's growing, and you'll see the schism is growing in South Africa as well, emanates from the question, does a Black African from Africa represent the kind of transformation that Americans, Black Americans are seeking when they talk about affirmative action or deconstructing the legacy of slavery within the American system? Or does a Black American represent that America is now shifting? And so these schisms that we see between within the Black or African descent diaspora across the world create a very fractious and difficult environment in which to have the conversation about how to create our autonomous knowledges and reactivate our agency. These are some of the questions that I think I would like Uchenna and Mutinda to attend to. And of course, my view has been that part of this schism lies very much in the need, in the few spaces that Black people in general, wherever they're from, have, whether it's a Black person in South Africa, whether they come from South Africa or come from the greater parts of the continent, whether they come from the United States, whether they come from the Caribbean, you find that wherever we are, we're still pigeonholed. Where well-resourced systems are concerned, we're still pigeonholed to fighting for the few positions which can resource us to do the kind of work that we wish to do. And so what we find, in fact, is that the African question then gets subsumed by the career question, which is the survival question, which is actually a class and aspirational question. You want to survive, you're going to want to play the games that are played because the spaces are so few. But simultaneously, you want to do what is necessary for Africa, and yet to do that, you somehow have to step aside from what the same international space you're competing for wants in reality. And so we find that I think we are dealing with a very difficult economic and material reality for Africans in general, African academics in general, as they try to work out how are we going to produce this autonomous knowledge? Our careers are crushing us, our opportunities are limited, and the question of when and how to think about Africa is becoming one really of, in many ways, a pantomime. So we play the decolonial scholar because it will get us somewhere. We play the Black feminist because it will get us somewhere. But in reality, if we look at what we are really producing and what you're really doing with your life, you'll find that there's very little. I want to just say, because I only have 10 minutes, is that one of the key, almost like in wrapping up, is that the reason we need to answer this question and we need to confront it for what it is because if we're going to deal with ideas require that, especially ideas that are going to be helpful to Africa, they require a level of depth and rigor and intellectual honesty that can actually resolve the complex layers of the problems that we face. Pedro Mzileni the other day asked the question about what is the meaning of Pan-Africanism in the urban context of Africa, where we see our cities becoming slumified. You can't just say Pan-Africanism, but you cannot attend to the question of the Lagos slum of Johannesburg in the middle of a South African crisis of its own making and a Zimbabwean crisis. And if you avoid those questions, then you are not actually helping to deal with the real material and economic problems. So the call for me is a call for bringing questions to context, not to play the pantomime, not to position ourselves as Black scholars or as radical decolonial scholars, whatever decoloniality means, but to be able to build a technical ability to be able to actually attend to the problems of Africa, a conceptual ability that can deal with the contradictions like the one that I've outlined, where you see that the people who are actually fighting about the questions of Africa are positioned in a class sense to fight each other actually for positions in the university system. We want to also deal with these questions with a level of integrity in conclusion, because what we need is this ontological sense of ourselves as Africans to have a level of integrity and a level of confidence and depth so that we can deal with difficult issues. You cannot deal with your own marginalization if you lack an ontological rooting. I can't go into depth about the ontological rooting, but perhaps when we go into questions, but I can just describe it like this. The reason that our Dean for Science, Azwindini Muronga, the theoretical physicist, constantly points out that the top performing Black students and top students in general in South Africa come from a rural area in Limpopo, because they are still very rooted ontologically in their actual African context. And that for me is the question, is the evidence of how understanding ourselves rigorously and deeply in context actually has tangible outcomes for knowledge making and for training African minds and producing substantive knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nomalanga, for that thought-provoking engagement. Indeed, we need to have such perspectives, which I believe were quite honest. Other people may think that they are uncomfortable, but I think Professor Nomalanga really raised some aspects that we really need to think about. Please be reminded again, colleagues, you can engage in the comment section. You can write your comments and questions so that I can read them out when the time comes, or you can raise your hands when I open the floor. And now for Dr. Mutinda Nzioki. Over to you, Doctor.
No, thank you for this opportunity. I think I'll pick up from where Professor Mkhize has left, and she lays a very good foundation for what you want to do. And mine is to also bring everyone into this, in that I do not believe that the work that we're supposed to be doing with this process of revisiting and re-entering Africa again should be left solely to the academy. And I'm looking at it in three ways. First, building from Nomalanga's work, and I'm going to quote something that was written by Sierra Leonean poet, Abiese Nicole, who said, "You are not a country, Africa. You're a concept, fashioned in our minds, each to each, to hide our separate fears, to dream our separate dreams." And then the second quote I begin with is something that was said by the late Kwame Nkrumah's press aide. His name was Kofi Bueno Hajor, who said, "Africa should not believe that there are certainly two sides to a story." And why am I saying this? I mean, these are acclamations made at a time when things were difficult for Africa. But what I take from them now is a possibility to open deeper, courageously, move beyond what Nomalanga has called a positioning that is very damaging. In fact, forecloses the possibility for African opening concepts for ourselves. Yet we've got good grounding. The people who are fighting then, who started then, already had big ideas on how we can think of Africa for itself. And so increasingly, the idea of speaking Africa, Africanity, finding meanings, settles into what I call common sense, and in pejorative sense, an attractive, tempting assumption of collective habit, that we can just produce slogans and catchphrases for jobs, all this in relation to another somewhere there who we think we're still fighting with, yet we remain dishonest and lazy. And in fact, our thought becomes stale. And I'm thinking, I'm going to invite us, mine here is to invite us by looking at what has gone before, some things that we've never, some concepts, some terms that on Africanity, in fact, an attitude, a courage that came at a time when Africa was moving from humiliations of political colonizations, and some of the words that were given at the time were very powerful. And one of them was something that Chinua Achebe said, if Africa is to think of itself, then it ought to be a continual commitment to fight and rethink new agreements, new meanings of African Africanity to meet exigencies of its time, because the problems that Africa was finding itself in that time and finds in itself now do not resolve themselves. What we find now is problems, as Nomolanga has pointed out, that have morphed into new configurations. And of course, one of the ones that I like that punches that is something that was produced by the Nigerian maestro Fela Kuti, who spoke of the life of suffering and smiling. And that was post-independence. And that's a continuum of struggles to live, and you're required then to grin and continue with your disposable life. And yet, those fundamental problems, those ones have not yet gone. Humiliations continue now. Questions of dignity. How do we speak about dignity? African dignity. How do we speak of humanness, Ubuntu, Ujamaa now, in the face of all this? The second one I'm going to add to this is, in order then for us to open this, then we need to do what I call a re-entry, a repurposing of concepts that were used to strive for the same thing we are asking us to do now, but have never lapsed. You know, there were powerful concepts and practices that were produced at a certain times, acclamations on meanings of Africa, that we can reopen, rearrange, give new speeds, new impetus, so that we can find tools to calibrate sharply meanings of what it is to be Africa, even if we won't find immediate solutions, but it keeps us in a continual, honest, courageous movement to forcing us, thinking Africa in relation to itself. And the third one I'm going to bring there is, importantly, this should not be left to the academy. And I say this because the academy, especially in Africa, and given the kind of careerism that Nomolanga has pointed out, we've ended up producing resources, grammars, and meanings and attitudes about communities, and we believe we speak on their behalf. Yet, there are projects that started before. The problem of, in fact, the problem that arose of Africans feeling the temptation to respond started with people being lazy, entering into African context, into spaces, not doing the work, not interested, and they come there saying they have tools for speaking about everywhere and everything in the world, and they didn't learn language, they didn't learn concepts, they didn't learn idiom. And so some of that work we've carried, and we continue to speak on behalf of community, yet in a world that has changed so much now, where people can broadcast themselves, the academy might end up being irrelevant over time. So how do we access deeply and honestly those other areas and meanings of Africanity and Africa, or the Africa we want, if we do not connect with community? I quote a philosopher who says the intellectual and theorist have ceased to be a consciousness that represents or is representative. And those involved in political struggle have ceased to be represented by any entity that would claim itself a right to their conscience. And I believe that's an attitude that we need to take. Even though we are Africans, we should not assume in the academy that we have a right to just represent and speak on behalf of the communities that surround us. We need to connect with them intentionally. And for that, I'm just going to try and wrap up with a few examples of those three intentions: creating new concepts, pushing us, forcing us to courageously and honestly start thinking concepts, taking from terms that were used before. For instance, Soyinka reminded us recently in a conference that I went, maybe it's a time we forgot the heartwarming Africa Unite. Why should Africans think of African unity? Why should we think, what interest is it of that young African, and many young Africans are educated who cannot find jobs? who are trying to run away from Africa, going through perilous journeys to Europe and America, saying, one of them said, I want to be somebody. Why should they think of themselves as Africans? And so comes to the thing that Nomalanga asked, Pan-Africanism. What is in our interest? How much more are we doing to then live with those who were forced, what we call forced adjacency, Africans killing other Africans? So the idea of Ubuntu, Ujamaa, all those concepts of what is it to be Africa, the Africa I want to strive for, the concepts that have existed, some of them have not yet lapsed, but we have the opportunity now with this seminar then to start creating new agreements. And I'll finish with a quote by Oyekan Omela, who says, the one who steals a goat in the market is not one of us, but one who builds a two-story house is one of us. And I believe that says, even if we are in forced adjacency, to think of ourselves courageously and honestly as Africans, we are being called then to force ourselves to start thinking courageously and deeply and honestly with the resources that we have in our communities and within the academy, open new concepts of thinking of Africa in relation to itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nzioki, for that address. And I really think what stood out for me was how you stressed the collective responsibility of the knowledge transmission project, as well as how we need to rearrange and re-articulate the meanings of Ubuntu and African dignity. Thank you, Doctor. And now over to Professor Uchenna Okeja. Over to you, Prof.
Yeah. I hope you can hear me. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for taking the time to join us for this conversation. Actually, it is a conversation that I would want to have with all of you. I am going to try within the next couple of minutes to speak to this question of African knowledge from a very simple, I hope, clear perspective. What I would try to do is to try to investigate two questions, or rather to discuss two questions. I don't know if I will be able to answer them, but I will try. The first question is, what do we imagine when we put Africa and knowledge together? The second question is, what is the nature of this relationship between Africa and knowledge, and what should it be? So, the two questions that will guide my discussion of my attempts to speak to this particular issue. But let me begin with a story. The British colonialist administrators arrived in the territory of British Columbia. They met the indigenous people there. This story was told by Edward Chamberlain in one of his books. So these administrators arrived in the territory and they claimed the land, of course, for the British colonial government. The indigenous people there were baffled. They were confused because the colonial administrators brought them together to tell them that this land now belongs to the British colonial government. The people protested and said all kinds of things. And after a while, one of the elders said to the British administrators, he asked them a question. He said, now, if this is your land, where are your stories? And they couldn't answer the question because they said, yes, where are your stories that attach you to this land? And it was on that basis that the British colonial administrators understood that they could not just get their way. Now, the importance of this story for me is just to point out the power of the sort of stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and about our world. And what that does, we know that, essentially, even the sciences are stories, stories about atoms, stories about, experiments conducted. The very essence of our engagement with reality somehow come together around the sort of stories that we tell ourselves in relation to the kind of reality that we want to create, which itself is an embodiment of a story. So now, when we want to talk about the relationship of Africa and knowledge, the problem is that even the site for telling this story is very limited, because even in African academia, universities in Africa and research institutes in Africa, the reality is that we have created only one discipline since we started doing these things in its current form, and that is African literature. There is nothing else we've created, no discipline. So we tend to then have this kind of situation where the story of the relationship between Africa and knowledge is one that relies on external kind of actors, imagination, and all those kind of things. But that is by the way. So when we talk about the relationship, when we bring Africa and knowledge together, what do we imagine? At least amongst all the possibilities there is one thing, which is the relationship of Africa to knowledge. But what is the nature of this relationship? With the emphasis on nature. What is the nature of the relationship between Africa and knowledge? Now, I think there are two possible perspectives. The one being a descriptive perspective and the other being a prescriptive perspective. So when we bring these two together, then we might have a kind of a broad perspective on the relationship between Africa and knowledge. Let us try to look at, first of all, the descriptive angle. When we want to talk about the relationship of Africa and knowledge, what we sometimes hear is couched, to talk about deficits, lack, underperformance, inadequacy, poor quality. You see, we talk about the informal. That is one descriptive angle, which I wouldn't want to get too much into because it is all around us. People say, our universities are deficient, the universities lack resources. In fact, you see all kinds of university administrators from Africa going to Europe and America to form partnerships to tell all kinds of stories of lack. We lack this, we lack that, we lack this, we lack that. And so that is the reason for underperformance, inadequacy, poor quality, and all that. That is one descriptive perspective. Then there is another descriptive perspective, which is a form of assertiveness, the apportionment of blames, the theater of victimhood, where we find people saying, no, we have to decolonize, all these imported concepts and ideas and theories, we have to leave them aside, we have to throw them away, throw them overboard so that we really can live and be the kind of people that we are supposed to be. That is another descriptive angle. Then there is a third descriptive perspective, which is a positivist kind of approach, which is more quantitative in nature. And what happens here is that people turn to a form of aggregation of output, a sort of a quantitative process where when we want to talk about the relationship of Africa to knowledge, what we talk about is usually the kind of output, the kind of uniqueness. So the first African to do this, the first African to do that, the first African to do this, to produce this or that. And so we begin to aggregate output. The best university in Africa is one that has a large army of professors publishing in certain kinds of journals in Europe and in America, or certain kinds of accredited journals in Africa, and we aggregate. They have put out 2 billion articles and all these kind of things. And we have this as an answer to the question, what is the relationship between Africa and knowledge, and what should it be? Now, the uniting point of these three perspectives seem to me to be the understanding that knowledge is an act. I wouldn't want to say action, but knowledge is an act. And by an act, I mean that it is the process of doing and not really what has been done or completely achieved such that nothing can be done. So knowledge as an act is the unifying point of all the descriptive perspectives that I've just outlined. But when we act, we aim at realizing some end, right? So if we are not satisfied with the three perspectives just described, then we can look at the relationship of Africa and knowledge from this unifying perspective, which is to consider knowledge as an act. Thus the question becomes, how has the relationship between Africa and knowledge as an act unfolded, and what are the goals of this act? There are, of course, different perspectives. One perspective, Kofi Awono, I'm borrowing his concepts here. He talked about African intellectuals as intellectual smugglers. That is one perspective. You know, you smuggle questions from other contexts to the African context, and you pose those questions on African reality. So yeah, when you hear something like, say for instance, the idea of Ubuntu, then you say, does the Ubuntu actually allow for the respect of human rights? So how has human rights been discussed in Europe and in America? Then you impose it on this particular thing. And that kind of mixture, you know. So Kofi Awono says, this is actually the game of intellectual smugglers. And he has another concept. He says, mercenaries in foreign battles. So you are going on about something that, but not about anything around you, right? You are talking about snow, you are doing experiments to, you know, those things are not useless, but, you know, they are curious, especially if everyone around you is dying because there is a war that nobody understands how it happened, and you always spend your time doing is to talk about how snow should be dealt with. Then there is the other perspective, which we can see in the work of somebody like Mahmoud Mamdani, playing the role of informants, native informants, you know, data gatherers, and not theory producers. You know, there is the possibility also of approaching this from the angle of saying that, you know, surrogates of alienated utopia. Surrogates of alienated utopia in the sense that utopia, imagine for Africa, by African you know, producers of knowledge usually are not rooted in the realities of the people. Then there is the possibility of also considering it from the angle of masters of hard life, Lebenskünstler, so to speak, you know. But my view is that all these perspectives do not suffice to explain what the story has been. I think that the different possibilities come together to exude all the complexities that are part of what it means to be human. So the issue here is not that there is one story to tell about how Africans have related to knowledge, either as intellectual smugglers or mercenaries in foreign, but these singular stories, these unique perspectives, do not seem to me to respect or to appreciate the complexity that is involved. And if we acknowledge the complexity that is involved, we will see that it is actually a reflection of the complexity of what it means to be human. And if this is the case, then the story is one that is that embodies an ever-changing reality, a reality that needs constant evaluation, critique, and revision in light of new aims, challenges, and opportunities. So that is the descriptive perspective. Now you remember I said there is another perspective, which is the prescriptive perspective. What does it entail? This is the perspective or the area where we now consider what should be, although it is not, but what should be the relationship of Africa and knowledge. And there is no shortage of answer, or responses in this regard. In fact, there are too many answers, but I'll try to capture as much as I can of these answers under three broad categories. One is the pragmatic view, and I'm using pragmatic here, not in the philosophical sense. So this view says the relationship should be one where African knowledge producers focus on harnessing knowledge or whatever they do to create a developed society where people are happy and fulfilled. That is the idea of leveraging knowledge to unlock the sense of earthly salvation. Another perspective is the anti-West view, where the idea is that Africa should, or the knowledge producers in Africa should do one thing and one thing only, which is that they should reject all that is non-indigenous They should reject all that is non-indigenous, sort of finding African solutions to African problems. Then the third perspective is emancipatory kind of view, which sees knowledge production, or what the relationship between Africa and knowledge should be, as an emancipatory activity. That is, a conception of this relationship as a series of events aiming to attain freedom from all that oppress us, be it foreign powers, local powers, physical constraints, mental limitations, cognitive inadequacies, and all those kind of things. Now, there are problems with these three perspectives. So what do we do? And how do we find an answer to the question posed? Which is, how do we tell the story of the relationship between Africa and knowledge? I think the emancipatory view has a lot of potential, and we have to explore it further, but I am not able to go into details of what it entails. But let me just say that what these perspectives tell us is that the relationship between Africa and knowledge should be one premised on the understanding that knowledge is supposed to create hope. The problem I see in Africa today is hopelessness that is occasioned, a sort of hopelessness that is attached to the crisis of habitability in the continent. Places like Lampedusa have become mass graveyards of the dreams of young Africans who could not hope to become real human beings in their own place under the sun. So the relationship between Africa and knowledge is supposed to be one that gears towards the creation of hope. This is the core of what has been disturbed in this relationship in the last 500 years, in my opinion. That is, that knowledge creators within the African continent have stopped being purveyors of hope, but rather something else. So rather than create hope, the relationship between Africa and knowledge has become so impoverished because those who are supposed to attend to the health of this relationship have become alienated, separated from this core task. They do this because rather than function as bearers and purveyors of hope, they have become one, consultants creating value for foreign ideas and funders. Mamdani explicates this point very lucidly in his book, Intellectuals in the Marketplace. Two, they have become more or less, the African intelligentsia have become more or less, we have become, if I'm able to consider myself one of them.
Sorry, Prof. Sorry, you have 2 minutes left.
We have become gendarmes, foot soldiers of unrooted ideals imported by secular missionaries. Secular missionaries are people that we generally call NGOs, but I think that the category of secular missionary explains better what is going on. Then three, they've become regime puppets singing praises in the service of politicians. And four, we have become oppressors usurping powers that never existed. That is, claiming ownership of the means of production of knowledge, thinking that the university belongs to us, when indeed that question does not have that kind of answer. Anyway, so to conclude, the question to ask is how to repair this relationship between Africa and knowledge. That is, what should we do? The task of knowledge creation in Africa, I propose, must be relocated to inhere in the creation of conditions that formalizes the informal. Now we see that on the continent, in the different spheres that matter to human life, informality plays a central role, but still it has no meaning. It has no relevance, so to speak, in the official scheme of affairs. So we find that informality in politics is not relevant to the African state. But people settle their problems, people engage in political interactions through the appropriation of traditional norms of deliberation, predominantly in Africa. But this does not matter to the African state. Informality in the economy, informal traders do more for real human beings in different African societies, but that doesn't matter when we talk about the economy, precisely because the idea is to focus on the stock exchange. Then there is the informality in culture. Today, when we talk about culture, the African states and all the focus is on heritage and monuments. But then culture for many people in the continent has a lot to do with the creative art of real people, you know. Then informality in education, indigenous languages and all that. I mean, we all know what is happening. So formalizing the informal seems to me to be one way to pursue the entire conceptual repair that is necessary for us to reposition the relationship of Africa and knowledge in a way that will serve the continent. And so since I do not want to receive another warning, I think I wouldn't want to go on and on because it is a dialogue. So let me stop here, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Prof. Okeja. That was very thought-provoking, and indeed, Professor Nomalanga really laid a foundation on what was about to follow, and I actually liked your prescriptive and descriptive aspects of how us as Africans we view ourselves and how others view us. And now it's time for the question and answers, and I'm going to quickly start with the chat box. Dr. Babalama Kokwana says, when Masru asked who killed the African intellectual in 1993, it appears that state involvement was the core in how we do things in post-colonial Africa today. We have increased careerism, individualism, and which can be disguised by ideologies that are sometimes not taking the actual socio-economic conditions of the working class majority in our countries. Thanks, Nomalanga, for honesty in this regard. Prof. Nomalanga, would you like to add there?
I was just gonna wait until maybe all the questions
Okay. All right.
or
Okay.
people had commented.
All right. Sia Tokozamtolo says, a question for Professor Mkhize. I am interested in your argument that when I surmise ultimately is on the personalization, racialization, and in some cases, tribalization of knowledge. Might this characterization help us better appreciate our understanding of knowledge and its systems when from our own theorizations we come across contradictions that we think may be unique to Africans, yet may or may not simply be what knowledge for both Africans and non-Africans present itself as. In other words, are these struggles over knowledge qualitatively particular to Africans rather than applicable to all races and creeds? What might our response to this question influence our appreciation for such concepts or realities as decolonization? That was a mouthful. Prof?
This is the question by
Siyathokoza Mtolo.
Siyathokoza. I felt that was more a question for Mutinda and Uchenna. I certainly don't think that it's about Africans in particular. So can I leave that one for them?
Kama, yeah.
Yeah.
You're right, Namalanga. Kama, any one of the panelists can respond to any of the questions, okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was much more interested in the one underneath that by Isaiah, who's commenting on the ontological rootedness. Does it resolve the problem of race and class? And I think that's the most important question for me. When we talk about African ontology, African culture, does it resolve this issue, or are we devolving down to essential, or not use the word essentialisms, but are we now substituting forms of cultural affinity for actual structural analysis? Yes, it depends on where you stand, and no, depending on where you stand. For every Africanist position, there's a progressive one and there's a reactionary one. So we do have to be explicitly progressive when we talk about ontological rootedness, because otherwise we can end up with an ontology that becomes, just symbolic, it's just, oh, we're African, kente cloth, that kind of thing. But when we're talking about a progressive conception of ontology, now we're dealing with the stuff that Jimmy Adesina always was pushing into us, that you're drawing your conceptual rigor from the respect of the people around you. So in terms of knowledge making, it's about respecting that our grandmothers are equally as rigorous as the professor that we meet in the classroom. It's knowing how to look at former white universities as spaces where there's traditions of knowledge, but knowledges that can also be challenged, but also understanding that even at home where we come from, those spaces have their own forms of debate and contestation. So I always point out that African tradition is highly African philosophical issues are highly contested in our home spaces. And you can see that in just basic things like when you learn Izithakazelo or clan names, that there's always a contestation about the knowledge around just things like clan names. But the class question is not easy to resolve because of how largely the middle class can appropriate the culture issue to kind of dress up their alienation. So you can see it, for example, in Joburg, where sadly wonke umuntu isayisangoma ngugogo. Now I have deep respect because I come from family with traditional healers. But what you get is the middle classes appropriating the language of ontology and African culture to actually deal with their own alienation, but not resolve the class question within their own environment. So that is something that, those are the questions that I think we need to be going into. And I love, that's why I thought the question was important, that that's precisely the types of questions that Africans we need to ask, because we can't do without the ontological issue, because then our children become alienated. And when they become alienated, they become less capable of competing. We know that. I know that from just, I know that students who go to white tradition spaces most of their lives come out with less intellectual capability than a child in a rural area. But the child who goes to the white mostly area learns the language and grammar of middle classness, of suburbanness, of whiteness, so they can speak well, they can call the manager on you, they can protest with articulate language, but they cannot understand other people's problems. They cannot easily see other contexts because they've been raised educationally within a white pedagogic environment. So the class issue and the ontological issue for me is a thesis.
Okay, Prof. Would Dr. Nzioki would like to comment on that, or Prof. Uchenna? Anything to add?
I would ask Uchenna to speak to it.
What is the question?
The question was, specifically for Nomolanga, does ontological rootedness solve the dynamics between race and class among Black Africans? So I'm asking if any of you would like to add to that.
Yes, yes. So you see, the issue is very simple. We have to begin with the question of what is African ontology today? Can we speak about such a thing? Now, why does this particular question arise? It arises because there has been a gap in the with regard to reflection on African ontology, such that we seem not to have a clear procedure of integrating subsequent developments into what we consider to belong to the category of African ontology. So when you talk about rootedness in African ontology as a panacea for this problem, the question immediately arises whether there is such a thing as an African ontology. If there is, what is it? That is, you know, a question of someone whose agency has become complicated in a way that overtakes the conceptual resources available to that person. And so it is not a useless question that reflects some kind of, lack of ability, but rather a signal that something fundamental has gone wrong with regard to how that individual or individuals that are located within a particular existential space deal with the reality of self-conceptualization. So we cannot know reality without having the tools to know reality. And we cannot know reality in a vacuum. And if all we know about ourselves goes into the definition of the ontological category that we ascribe to a group, say Africans or Europeans or anybody, any group, whatever there is, then you see that there is a fundamental issue implicated here. But I would like to think that there is a chance to transcend this kind of a paralysis. And that chance has to do with asking a very simple question. What, regardless of whatever gap there is in the theorizing of the self that we consider to be the African self, what does the African want to become today, in the here and now? The answer to this question emerges from interrogating the very problems that we encounter today. So it is by addressing the problems of today that we are able to remake the possibilities or the resources of the past in the interest of what we want to become going forward. So I think that there is that opportunity. And this is something that I do not think that anybody can claim to have an answer to. But then there is a perspective, there is an opportunity for us to begin to reflect about this issue differently. And I think that that is the point of this seminar series, so to speak.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Just a reminder to the speakers, when you respond, please turn your video on for recording purposes. We have a comment and question by Abiodun Afolabi. He says, I agree with Prof. Nomalanga that we have to engage to move beyond the critique of Eurocentrism as a career pattern, because it is less of a reflection of our present and important issues than even the West that we are responding to. My question here is, A, we cannot rule out the fact that our stories must be rightly told, and that this must be done by actors and not externalists, referring to what Prof. Okeja said. So, when externalists attempt to frame knowledge about Africa in a clandestine manner, I think Africans must respond to that, whether it is a response to these Western worldviews or Eurocentric critique, for two reasons. Number one is the hermeneutic privilege of the oppressed, not important. That's a question. And B, developing new concepts to reimagine our present realities in Africa is laudable, but the challenge has been envisaged by Professor Uchenna. How do we formalize the informal? How do we import concepts in Africa to global discourse without making it ethnocentric? Another question to all the panelists is, how do we break out of the competitive environment of pursuing knowledge in the same way the world is undertaking the project? It tends to be, programmatic and repetitive, with incremental and little gains, especially in science. A very little proportion of the works have impact to the African conditions. And so who is it being produced for? This is where the careerism and individualism becomes meaningless, because we need to seek approaches that matter to our conditions. While we are closely reading the global approaches, maybe we can have meaningful contributions. Dr. Nzioki, any input on that?
No, thank you. I mean, the kind of question that is being asked there, I think Professor Okeja had already addressed. And the one thing that I said before, we have to admit that we need to have a starting point. I mean, I say, using Uchenna's words, the informal, making the informal formal. And I said we need to have deliberate and actually, intentional moves to involve community, the communities around us. And that is for everything. If you're going to speak language policy, you need to invite, your ordinary people who are working with poetry, with song, with idiom, into the academic space. I think one of the things that worries me when we have conversations like this, you'll find that we are talking to the converted. You're talking to people who have the same kind of impulse about this. And it's possible to very quickly create a sort of cul-de-sac, feeling senses of impossibility. I'll come back to Uchenna's question. What is it that we want? What kind of Africa do we want here and now? And probably we don't have answers. And I keep saying, if you're looking for answers around things like concepts, because concepts are unique responses to problems that throw themselves at you, sometimes without answers. And you first walk through finding meaning before you find solutions. So if you say you're going to walk into now we come with solutions now so that we can break some of the cul-de-sacs where some work has not been done because we are still doing the work. Then we are supposing that a solution exists somewhere already and we need to go find it. Then that then invalidates the very process of getting into courageous, honest discussions about the work we need to do and to break these deadlocks. So again, we begin with the questions, and Uchenna had said that clearly. Probably we don't have all the answers now, but we have possibilities. And that's why we have this seminar series. If we do not have answers about what is the kind of knowledge we want, because if we say we have knowledge that is African and is designated and it's stuck, then we don't have a problem. So where do we begin? How do we access these resources? And where do we find these resources? And I kept on insisting, we cannot do this in the academy now and answer this meaningfully if we do not intentionally and deliberately engage communities in the informal spaces inside here. And Uchenna keeps reminding me, for instance, if we look at now the reference point for most young people in Africa when they, in the political space and activism, when you speak to a lot of people, young people in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Tanzania, the metaphor they use, the imagery they use is derived from songs that are being created by their own musicians now. And slowly the American or European rapper or hip hop artist or whatever has receded in the background because the resources they receive, the idiom, the use of language from that musician or artist in their country brings meaning much sharply, can calibrate their problems much closer to them, to understanding their world and to make a few steps. So we need to ask ourselves again, what is it that we want the here and now when we do not have a concept? And erasure of all concepts that exist doesn't guarantee us that we're going to have a unique African thing. So it's work, we still need to work. Thanks.
Can I just say something here? So I think we can't avoid the work, but what kind of work is it? Because I tend to disagree with the position that we start with questions first and sort of try and repair ourselves. That was the failure of Black consciousness. The Black consciousness movement tried to start with self-pride and then move to liberation. Now, it was correct that we need to fix ourselves in order to get the liberation that we're going to be able to sustain. It was correct about that. But the trouble is the conditions of our current existence are intolerable anyway. And that's why so many young people ended up having to leave the Black consciousness movement and shift towards, well, not leave it, I mean, they're kind of smashed by the state, but they have to leave the Black consciousness movement and join the organized forces, which were the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, in order to begin to fight the apartheid regime. So yes, they had these ideas, but then they needed to give them effect in the organized structures. And then when we look the ANC was the most effectively organized structure. And a lot of it lay in, of course, so we go back, it lay in the fact that people like Oliver Tambo had a very strong African ontology. So Oliver Tambo had a very strong African ontology and an African Christian ontology. So those Africanisms together to be able to formulate a movement that people could actually hold, he could hold moral authority. So my argument is that in fact, what you need, it's a very difficult task. You need to be able to produce a cohort or generations of knowledge makers who can hold moral authority. Now, I don't know, maybe my students will think here at Mandela will disagree with me. I'm generally a very nice person, but I'm not an easy person, especially not towards students, because I understand as a Black African, if I don't hold moral authority with my students, I cannot transmit any sense of ethic, values, or independence in them. So the Africanist position is to take hold of your moral authority and transmit that so that you can actually create a kind of a Black person that when confronted by the international competition or confronted in the international space, doesn't capitulate, but can also play the game. So the question of moral authority of the pedagogue. Now, I want to give an example of how important moral authority is. It is my view that during the student movement, when predominantly our colleagues who are white liberals said yes to anything and everything that students did because they don't share perhaps the same feeling of moral, that they can exert moral authority in Black spaces. So Students are about to firebomb a place with people in it. Oh, okay, I guess, okay. No, how can you as a Black person throw a firebomb into a room with ama security amnyama who are more working class than you as you are sitting in this university fighting for your radicalism? What Black lecturer can go along with that? We can't go along with that. What idiom do I then access to be able to? I cannot use Karl Marx. I cannot use Fanon. I cannot use abstraction. I can only say, as a Black person, as an African, that behavior for me does not in any way, shape, or form fit into the way in which we have conducted our struggles and intellectual battles. So to be able to stand your ground in the first instance on issues like that, and then to be able to convey that with a strong sense of absolute seriousness about what we are doing here, it begins there. Because if we were to wait, Mutinda or Jan, if we were to wait, we cannot ask questions first. They have to be asked while we produce. And so I think the task is to produce a cohort of people first. I don't know what people think about that, but to me, moral and normative ethos and ethic is the most important thing we can instill in the new generation. And it does take then invoking those Africanist normative views, and it works. That is why the children in Bembe district pass, because the adults, they have moral authority, which affirms them. When the adults, the Black African adult says, hey, do not do that, but I believe you are strong enough to do that. The student knows what is being said. The learner knows that they are being affirmed, and then they can take on the world. But this wishy-washy, like weird Western liberal, Marxist Fanonist, theoretical thing that we keep propounding in our universities, and then our students leave as if they were never in Africa. No, I can't. I'm done.
Perhaps I should add to that. I think that part of the issue here is to return to the question, why are these things that we imagine as the panacea to the problems in Africa, why are they not happening? And why are they not happening specifically in the context of the university? I think that part of the reason here, or the issue, is that we have to consider the university as more than a space for intellectuals and learners. And here I'm not referring to this whole notion of community engagement alone. That is essential, but the way we think about it, the way we think about the citizenship of the university in the society is essential. And the self-understanding of the African intellectual has never been static. We just have to look at what it was in the 60s. That is, the way African intellectuals understood themselves in the 60s and also in the 70s and 80s, and now there has no, their self-perception as scholars has not been static. So if the manifestation today of the self-understanding of the African intellectual, especially within the context of the university, is of the nature we are talking about, that is not adequate, a bit removed from the real concrete issues in the society, then the question to ask is, why is that happening? Of course, universities go, embark on strike actions in many countries in Africa because the government has not provided the resources they need to create a kind of knowledge that would be useful, they say, to the people in the society. But is that the only thing that is happening? I think there is a very fundamental sense in which we have to ask ourselves questions about the corruption of the mind, that is, the sense in which the intellectual today sees the activity of intellection as a mechanical process that is supposed to lead to certain privatized ends. And that is where the question of who owns the university becomes very relevant. Because if we say, for instance, that part of the solution, part of what we can do to make knowledge creation in Africa relevant to African society, to the society at large, is to ensure that we bring in people that are not particularly part of the university into the conversations that the university has. Now, there is the question of how. Somebody has raised that in the chat. But fundamentally, the issue is that here the power dynamics is already defined. We are bringing you in. That means that we are affirming what I already talked about during my brief reflection. We are claiming ownership of something. And that for me is where the problem starts, because the power dynamics. But I think that the solution can begin to emerge when we take very seriously the point of immanent critique. That is, looking inward and critiquing that which we find problematic, first of all, as a stepping stone to where we want to be. That is, asking ourselves, really, is this the best we can do with regard to X, Y, Z? If this is not, how do we understand what is going on? How do we reflect this meaning and simultaneously create a different status quo? So we have to begin to relocate the university away from being a site for the performance of intellectual superstars and academic celebrities. Because thinking is not an event. It is a very conscious process that we all as human beings can contribute to. That would be my reflection on that.
We had a hand from Sia Togoza Mdolo. Sia, please raise your question.
Okay, I'm here. I'm still here. The question was basically from the long paragraph that I had written, and before just asking the question, I'd like to say I think my thinking is closer to Prof. Okeja's thinking on what every development might mean for us in our understanding of knowledge. But I guess I'm posing this question to all the panelists at the same time, because basically in its summary would be are these struggles of knowledge qualitatively particular to Africans then rather than applicable to all races and creeds. I'm thinking of is this struggle to claim a superior ownership of knowledge something that is happening and in particular ways to Africans rather than say Europeans? Would they not also be attempting to personalize or racialize their own understandings of things and realities? Let's say how they understand politics. Someone in America would be arguing from a different perspective than someone from France in the European continent. So my question is basically, are we arguing over something that is particular to African knowledge, or is this just the reality of all knowledges when you basically think about them? And then the follow-up question to that would be, once we've answered that question, what might this mean for our understanding and appreciation of such things as decolonization, basically bringing our knowledges closer to the African sort of context? Because now when listening to Professor Mkize, she mentions things about differences in children from Bembe district and other parts of the town of the country. And I'm thinking that that's a sort of contextualizing of knowledge and basically saying a knowledge would be contextual to a particular place. The place would be important in our understanding of knowledge. So is this understanding or characterization of knowledge something that could help us in basically better appreciating how knowledge is produced? And if we continue along this sort of line of thought, what might that mean for our understanding of knowledge. I think that's basically what I was attempting to ask.
Okay, Sia. All right, I'm going to take now. Okay, we'll take one last hand from Kevin, and then.
My question is about the critique of decoloniality that Professor Mkhize mentioned, and also it's connected to the question of Pan-Africanism that Professor Nzioki talked about. And so the first question has to do with, what the critique of decoloniality is here, whether the problem is decoloniality as such, as an approach that it cannot do any meaningful work, or whether it's a critique of how it has been done, the intellectuals who are working with the decolonial thinking, the kind of work they're producing, that's the issue, but not decoloniality as such. Because I think there is the reality of colonization and coloniality itself is not really gone. It is with us in many ways. And so there is a recognition of that reality, which is still with us today, that has to be taken into consideration if we are doing honest work as intellectuals. And that's also connected to the issue of Pan-Africanism. And I think the reason why, at least one reason why Africa and unity should be still thought together in many ways is that we recognize that there are ways in which Africans are still oppressed today as a collective. So I would like maybe Professor Mkhize and Professor Nzioki to say something about that, how we can take coloniality as something that's still real today and do work that answers to that reality.
I don't know if Kama's the one with the network problem or if I am.
You're fine, Nomalanga.
Okay.
Let me can't assist Kama quickly.
Yeah.
Continue. Any one of the panelists, and in the same breath, can you also do your closing remarks then?
Yeah, I think this is the I think I'm going to look forward to further engagement. I mean, I'm happy to do a whole session on why decoloniality is vacuous and insubstantive and won't take us anywhere. It's my position. And so I'm happy to argue and have rocks thrown around that, because I think it'll be very productive, because there's place where I make concessions about the value of the concept. So I think we should get into that. But I think the last thing that I want to say is that the real issue here is one of the economic and material conditions of Africans, and whether Africans can use their own conceptual agency to get out of their material and economic condition. And I think there is a burden and onus on the educated middle classes to do this, but we won't because we want to survive as middle classes. But I do think that we need to accept that it is the economic and material question of Africa's survival that will then give substance to whether or not our concepts are useful or not. So whether we take a concept from Japan and apply it here, that's the kind of thing that the world looks for. Whether we take the concept from the US and apply it here, if we make it fit for context and then it's robust enough to actually help us solve things or go forward in our solutions, then that's okay. Similarly, if the ideas themselves are emanating from our context and they solve. Very important question. Pedro asked this. We didn't get time to talk about it. We need that, Andre. What is Pan-Africanism in a Africa of slums? What is Pan-Africanism in the, what is his name? Mike, I forget his name, has already written the book on Planet of Slums. So if we talk about the planet of slums, that's not necessarily a concept I'm bringing, but I can see the slums in Africa. And I want to ask, what is Pan-Africanism in slums in the 20th century? Now we're starting to talk. But if we're gonna be like somewhere else, Nkurumaism, we're not gonna get anywhere.
Thanks, Nomalanga. Uchenna and Mutinda, closing remarks from your side?
No, thank you. Again, I come back to things that both Nomalanga and Uchenna have touched on. Africa in the now exists in very complex arrangements. I mean, some of the things like our economic life does not always entirely depend on the decisions that we'll make. We get into very difficult interactions. And so to come back to Kevin's question on the place of decoloniality, either as an attitude or decolonization as a discourse in itself, of course, there's still place for it. I think I go with what Kwasi Wiredu said. Africa found itself being forced into very difficult situations, not by choice. But then what he was arguing for was his idea of to decolonize is to remove undue influence of things borrowed from what Uchenna was saying, you know, conceptual smugglers, or somebody called it smash and grabbing. And that is removing undue influence and finding ways not to just translate concepts as Zeleza warns us and says, but to formulate. So if you remove undue influence, means getting into the rigorous work of deeply decoupling, dismembering, reassembling, as Uchenna says, so that we can answer the questions of our time, as difficult as it is, knowing that one of our biggest interests is to maximize our idea of being human in the world now. Thank you.
Thanks, Mutinda. Uchenna?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, I think that my point is very clear, which is that the way to proceed is to continue to ask ourselves questions about how to recreate hope in the continent. How can we contribute to this project of recreating hope as intellectuals? What kind of a research program should we be developing if we want to contribute to this goal? And how should we be interacting with each other as colleagues in the university, and how should we be interacting, how should the university space be interacting with the community, the larger society, in light of this question? So that for me is essential, because if we do not put our work as intellectuals in the service of this pursuit of hope, then the continent will continue to remain within the scope of these very serious problems we call the crisis of habitability. So that is the closing remark that I want to make. But I would like to also emphasize that part of what I think is essential in the entire project of reimagining the place of Africa in the world is to think very carefully about the very fact that we can do more than just be people regurgitating things from elsewhere. We have to take very seriously the project of theory creation, that is not just for its own sake, not just to say we have something unique African, but rather to imagine possibilities available to us using the resources that we have. So those are the two things I think that we should pay attention to, and the solutions, that is the practical solutions, will emerge one way or the other if we do that. Thanks to all of you for your attention.
Thanks, Uchenna and Mutinda and Nomalanga. This is amazing. So I must say I am reinvigorated and re-energized by the discussions, and of course it swung from so various points of departure, but I think beautifully orchestrated in a space like this, which has its own limitations. But I think for our first seminar in the series, this has been fantastic and it has been great. So both from Nomalanga's perspective around reactivating agency and the development of autonomous knowledges, to Sam's contention around the importance of community for developing new notions of Africanity, and then Uchena's more or less formula around Africa and knowledge as the production of hope. So if we bring those three together with different sets of discussions in the chats, which has been absolutely amazing, we will be recording that. I think that part of the contestations on the table has at least taken some form, through which more clarity and more productive actions can develop. So thanks so much for this. To everybody, we have been, just above 70. So to all of you who have made the time from number 1 to number 72, thanks so much for attending. And thanks for being here within the space. We all have our different ways of appearing and representing ourselves in the Zoom arena. That's our choices, but just so much thanks for being here and for sharing both your presence, your thoughts with us. And to Ochena Nomalanga Mutinda, thanks for an absolute, brilliant event that you have knocked together in so many respects. Anele and the rest of the Krisha team for holding the logistics and the admin together, and for Kama, of course, for so beautifully managing this process. Kama, I'm not sure whether you are back into the space. This is an inclusive circle, colleagues, with collaborations in different kinds of ways, bilaterals here, a group there, a network here and there. I see from my colleagues in the GDC space, the critical university space, I've also noticed some of my long-standing colleagues that I've known now for more than a decade or so. The same goes for Chena, for Sam, and for Nomalanga in all our different networks. So we really value this. And so we will then put together our next seminar and distribute the notification of the event well in advance. So have a lovely day for those of you who are only starting your morning now, and for the others, have a nice rest of the Friday and a great weekend lying ahead. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, colleagues.